There was, at the far edge of a long-forgotten coastline, a small harbor that maps no longer bothered to name, a place where the sea seemed to breathe more slowly than anywhere else in the world, as though even the tides had learned to rest, and in this harbor stood a single lantern, suspended from a curved iron hook outside a weathered wooden cottage, its soft amber glow swaying gently in the night breeze, never too bright, never too dim, just enough to remind the darkness that it was not alone. And each evening, as the sky deepened from blue into velvet indigo, a quiet keeper named Edward would step outside, his movements unhurried and familiar, carrying with him the calm weight of routine. And he would check the lantern's flame, adjusting the wick with careful fingers, listening not with his ears but with his whole being to the soft language of the sea, the hush of distant waves folding into themselves, the faint whisper of wind brushing over salt and stone, the almost silence that settles only in places untouched by urgency. Edward had lived here for as long as anyone could remember, though no one remained who could say exactly when he arrived, and he did not concern himself with time in the way others did, for in Quiet Harbor, time did not pass so much as it softened, stretching and thinning until moments felt like gentle ripples rather than measured steps, sometimes. In the late hours when even the seabirds slept and the lantern's glow became the only visible heartbeat in the night, Edward would sit on the small wooden bench beside the cottage, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his breathing slow and even, as though he were quietly echoing the rhythm of the waves, and he would watch the horizon where sea and sky dissolved into one another, not searching for anything, not expecting change, but simply allowing himself to be present in the stillness, which, like a warm blanket, wrapped itself around his thoughts and softened their edges. On certain nights, when the air was especially calm and the stars appeared like scattered silver dust above the water, the lantern's reflection would stretch across the surface of the harbor, trembling gently, and it would seem, if one looked long enough, that the light was not just illuminating the sea but guiding it, offering a quiet reassurance that even in darkness there is direction, even in silence there is a kind of companionship. And though no ships had entered Quiet Harbor in many years, Edward kept the lantern lit all the same, not out of duty, but out of a quiet understanding that some lights are not meant to be seen, only to exist, steady and patient, holding space for whatever may come, or may never come at all. And as the night deepened and the world beyond the harbor drifted further into distant memory, Edward would close his eyes just for a moment, breathing in the cool, salt-tinged air, and in that moment, everything, every wave, every flicker of light, every distant star, would seem to settle into a perfect, unspoken harmony, a lullaby without sound, gently inviting the mind to loosen, to quiet, and to rest. On the following night, when the sky once again softened into that deep and endless shade between blue and black, Edward stepped outside with the same quiet rhythm that had shaped his days for years beyond counting, yet something in the air felt subtly different, not sharper or colder, but deeper, as if the silence itself had grown more attentive, and as he adjusted the lantern's flame, he noticed the tide resting higher than usual along the worn stones of the harbor, the water gently touching places it rarely reached, not with urgency, but with a kind of careful curiosity, like a visitor who had come not to disturb but to remember. Edward did not question it, for he had long understood that the sea did not move randomly, but with a slow, patient intelligence, one that revealed itself only to those who were willing to notice without asking, and so he simply stood there for a while, watching as the faint glow of the lantern stretched farther across the water than it had the night before, its reflection elongating into a quiet path that shimmered with each small breath of the tide. He felt no surprise, only a gentle awareness, as though something familiar had shifted slightly into clearer view, like a thought that had always been present but had only now chosen to be seen. The air carried with it a softness that settled into his chest as he inhaled, and with each slow breath, the boundaries between his thoughts and the quiet world around him seemed to blur. Until there was no clear separation between the rhythm of his breathing and the rhythm of the sea, both rising and falling in a shared, unspoken cadence. Somewhere in the distance, barely more than a suggestion, a wave broke against the outer rocks, its sound softened by distance into a low and steady murmur, repeating itself with such consistency that it began to feel less like a sound and more like a presence. Something constant and reassuring, like the gentle ticking of time that no longer needed to be measured. Edward moved to the bench and sat, the wood cool beneath him, grounding and familiar, and he rested his hands once more in his lap, allowing his shoulders to drop, releasing any tension he might have carried without noticing. And as he gazed out over the water, he became aware of something else, not a sight, not quite a sound, but a feeling that lingered just beneath the surface of perception, as though the tide itself held memories, not in the way people do, with images and words, but in patterns, in movements, in the way it returned again and again to the same places, touching and retreating, never holding, never rushing, simply remembering through repetition. And in that quiet recognition, Edward felt a subtle easing within himself, as if something he had been carrying had gently loosened its hold, dissolving into the slow rhythm of the night. The lantern flickered once, softly, then steadied, its glow unwavering as it cast its light across the water. And for a long while, nothing changed, and yet everything seemed to deepen, the silence growing richer, the darkness softer, the world settling further into that calm, expansive stillness where thoughts no longer needed to form, where time no longer needed to move forward, and where the tide, in its quiet, endless remembering, seemed to carry not only the sea, but the weight of the world itself, gently rocking it toward rest. On a night when the horizon seemed to dissolve completely into the sky, leaving no clear line between above and below, Edward noticed something that at first appeared to be no more than a shift in the pattern of darkness, a faint suggestion of form resting far out on the still water, so distant and unmoving that it could easily have been imagined. Yet as he stood beside the lantern and allowed his gaze to soften rather than focus, the shape remained, steady and quiet, like a thought that refuses to fade when not pursued. It resembled a small boat, though no ripple spread from it, no reflection shimmered beneath it, and it seemed less like an object floating upon the sea and more like a presence resting within it. As though it belonged not to the surface but to the deeper stillness below. Edward did not feel curiosity in the usual sense, for curiosity often carries with it a need to know, and here there was no need, only a gentle openness, an acceptance of whatever was or was not there, and so he did not move closer, nor did he strain his eyes to confirm what he saw, but instead allowed the image to exist at the edge of his awareness, where certainty is not required and imagination and reality quietly overlap. The lantern beside him swayed slightly, its warm glow brushing across the dark water in slow arcs, and for a brief moment, the distant shape seemed to catch that light, not fully illuminated, but acknowledged, like something seen in a dream that does not ask to be understood. He walked to the bench and sat, the familiar creak of wood beneath him soft and grounding, and as he settled into stillness, the presence of the boat, or whatever it was, did not disturb him, but rather deepened the quiet, as though its very stillness invited everything else to soften further, to release even the smallest movements of thought. The sea remained calm, its surface like dark glass, unbroken and patient, and the air carried no urgency, no signal of change, only a continuous, gentle unfolding of silence. Time, if it passed at all, did so unnoticed, slipping between moments without leaving a trace. And Edward found that his breathing had slowed even more, each inhale arriving naturally, each exhale lengthening into a soft release, like the tide withdrawing from the shore. The distant shape did not come closer, nor did it fade, and in that quiet balance, neither approaching nor leaving, it seemed to hold a kind of peaceful certainty, as if reminding the night that not everything is meant to arrive, not everything is meant to be reached, and that there is a calm, steady comfort in simply allowing things to remain where they are, untouched and complete. The lantern continued to glow, unwavering, its light stretching across the harbor in a gentle path that led nowhere and yet felt like enough. And as Edward rested there, his eyes growing heavier without effort, the world seemed to settle even deeper into itself, the boat remaining distant, the sea remaining still, and the night, vast and quiet, folding softly around everything, like a story that does not need to end, only to continue, slowly and without interruption, into rest. As the nights continued to unfold in their unhurried rhythm, there came one evening when the stillness of quiet harbor seemed not merely present, but layered, as though beneath the familiar hush of wind and water there existed another, deeper quiet, one that did not belong to the surface of things but to something far more distant and steady. Edward sensed it not through hearing alone, but through a subtle awareness that settled into his chest as he stepped outside and paused beside the lantern, whose soft glow seemed gentler than usual, its light diffusing into the air like warmth rather than illumination, and as he adjusted the wick with slow, practiced care, he noticed that even the smallest movements, the brush of his fingers, the shift of his breath, felt softened, as if the world itself were absorbing any sharpness before it could fully form. He stood there for a while, not listening for a specific sound, but allowing his attention to drift downward, inward, toward that quiet presence beneath everything, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, he became aware of a low, steady resonance, not quite a sound and not quite a silence, something that existed in between, like the deep hum of the earth when all else has gone. Still, it did not rise or fall, did not begin or end, but simply remained, constant and calm, and the more he allowed himself to rest in its presence, the more it seemed to align with his own breathing. Until inhale and exhale blended seamlessly into that gentle, unbroken rhythm, the sea, too, seemed to respond, its surface nearly motionless, reflecting the faint shimmer of stars in such a way that it was difficult to tell where the sky ended and the water began, and for a moment, Edward felt as though he were standing not at the edge of the harbor, but within a vast, quiet space that extended in all directions. Without boundary or interruption, he moved to the bench and sat, his posture naturally easing, shoulders lowering, jaw softening, the subtle tensions of the day dissolving without effort, and as he rested there, the deeper quiet grew more present, not louder, but clearer. As though it had always been there, waiting patiently beneath the surface of thought and sensation. There were no memories attached to it, no images or words, only a steady, grounding presence that invited nothing and resisted nothing, and in its calm, Edward found that even the smallest flickers of thought began to slow, each one appearing and fading without leaving a trace, like faint ripples that never fully form. The lantern beside him swayed once, then stilled, its light steady and warm. And the distant horizon, now barely distinguishable from the sky, seemed to recede even further into softness, until distance itself felt irrelevant. Time, too, seemed to loosen its hold, no longer moving in a line but settling into a gentle stillness where moments did not follow one another, but simply existed, side by side, quiet and complete, and in that deepening calm, with the low, steady resonance continuing beneath all things, Edward allowed his eyes to close, not out of intention, but because there was nothing left that required them to remain open, and as the night held him in its quiet embrace, the sound beneath silence remained, constant and unchanging, like a quiet promise that rest was not something to be found, but something that had always been there, waiting patiently to be felt. On the next evening, as the quiet harbor settled once more into its familiar hush, Edward stepped outside and paused a little longer than usual at the threshold of the cottage, as if sensing that the night held something gently different, not in its appearance, for the sky still softened into deep indigo and the lantern still glowed with its steady, amber light, but in the way the air seemed to move, not around him, but with him, as though each breath he took was being quietly mirrored by the world itself. He walked slowly toward the edge of the shore, his footsteps soft against the worn wooden planks and then quieter still upon the smooth, cool stones, and as he stood there, looking out over the dark, glass-like surface of the sea, he became aware of a subtle rhythm, one that did not belong entirely to the tide, nor entirely to his own breathing, but to something shared between them, a gentle exchange that flowed in both directions. When he inhaled, the air felt fuller, as though the harbor itself were drawing inward, and when he exhaled, the water seemed to respond with the faintest outward movement, barely visible, yet undeniably present, like a quiet answer given without words. Edward did not try to understand it, for understanding would have required distance, and there was no distance here, only participation, only a soft merging of presence, and so he allowed his breath to continue as it wished. Slow and natural, each inhale arriving without effort, each exhale lengthening into a gentle release, and with each cycle, the sense of separation between himself and the shoreline seemed to fade just a little more. The lantern behind him cast a warm, steady glow that stretched across the stones and touched the edge of the water, its reflection trembling softly with each subtle shift of the sea, and for a moment, it seemed as though the light itself was breathing too, expanding and softening. In quiet harmony with everything around it, he moved to the bench and sat, though it felt less like sitting and more like settling, like becoming part of the stillness rather than observing it. And as he rested there, his hands loosely placed, his shoulders relaxed, he noticed that even the smallest tensions within him, those faint, unnoticed tightenings that linger beneath awareness, were beginning to dissolve, not through effort, but through the simple act of allowing, as though the harbor were gently taking them and returning them to the calm from which everything had come. The sound of the distant sea remained soft and steady, but now it carried with it a sense of closeness, as if the farthest edges of the water had drawn nearer, not in space, but in presence, and the horizon, once a line to be seen, now felt like something to be felt, a quiet openness that extended without boundary. Time, once again, seemed to loosen and soften, each moment stretching gently into the next without urgency, without demand, and in that slow unfolding, Edward found that there was nothing he needed to hold on to, nothing he needed to follow, only this steady rhythm of breath and shore, of inward and outward, of receiving and releasing, and as the night deepened, wrapping itself around the harbor in layers of soft darkness and faint starlight, the quiet exchange continued, breath meeting water, water meeting breath, until there was no clear beginning and no clear end, only a continuous, gentle flow, like a lullaby without sound, carrying everything, including Edward, slowly and effortlessly toward rest. As another night unfolded over Quiet Harbor, the sky appeared unusually clear, as though some unseen veil had gently lifted, revealing a deeper field of stars than Edward had ever noticed before, each one soft and steady, not sharp or distant, but calm, like quiet points of awareness resting in the vastness above. When he stepped outside and paused beside the lantern, its warm glow seemed to blend more seamlessly with the night, no longer a contrast to the darkness but a part of it, and as he looked upward, his gaze softened, not focusing on any single star, but allowing the entire sky to settle into his awareness at once, wide and open, without edges. There was no sudden change. No movement that could be clearly seen, and yet, after a while, it began to feel as though the stars were not as far away as they had once seemed, not physically closer, but gently more present, like something that had always been near but had only now become noticeable in the absence of distraction. The air was still, carrying only the faintest trace of salt and coolness, and as Edward breathed in, the quiet expanded within him, matching the openness above, until the space inside his chest felt as vast and unbounded as the sky itself. He walked slowly to the bench and sat, the familiar motion requiring no thought, and as he settled, he noticed how naturally his body followed the rhythm of the night. Shoulders easing downward, jaw softening, eyelids growing slightly heavier without effort, as though the stillness itself were guiding him gently inward. The stars remained steady, yet their presence seemed to deepen, not through brightness, but through a quiet clarity, each one existing without urgency, without needing to shine more or less, simply being what it was in perfect calm. And as Edward continued to rest there, his breathing slow and even, it began to feel as though the boundary between above and below had softened, the reflection of the stars appearing faintly on the surface of the water, so that sky and sea mirrored one another in a seamless, quiet symmetry. And for a moment, it was difficult to tell whether he was looking outward or inward, whether the vastness existed beyond him or within him, or perhaps both at once. The lantern's light stretched gently across the harbor, its reflection weaving between the faint points of starlight on the water, creating a soft, drifting pattern that moved without direction, without intention, like a thought that had forgotten how to form. Time seemed to slow even further, each moment widening into a calm, spacious pause, and in that pause, there was no need to anticipate what would come next, no need to hold on to what had already passed, only this quiet presence, steady and complete. The stars did not move, and yet they felt as though they had drawn nearer. Not through distance, but through stillness, as if by simply resting, the world had come closer to itself. And as Edward allowed his eyes to close for a moment, then longer, the image of the sky remained, not as something seen, but as something gently felt, a vast, quiet openness that held everything without effort, carrying him softly, steadily, into a deeper and deeper rest, where even the idea of distance faded, and all that remained was calm. On a night when the air felt especially gentle, as though it carried no weight at all, Edward noticed something within the quiet of the cottage that he had never quite noticed before, not because it had been hidden, but because it had never needed to draw attention to itself. As he stepped inside after tending the lantern, leaving its soft glow to rest outside in the darkness, he paused just beyond the threshold, his hand still loosely near the door, and for a moment, he became aware that the door was not fully closed, not fully open either, but resting in a calm, in-between state, where it neither separated nor connected completely, simply allowing the night air to move freely through the space. There was no draft, no chill, only a soft, continuous flow that carried with it the faint scent of salt and wood and something else, something difficult to name, yet deeply familiar, like the quiet feeling of being somewhere you have always belonged. Edward did not move to close the door, nor did he open it further, for there was no need to change anything. And instead he let his hand fall gently to his side and walked slowly across the small room, his steps unhurried, his awareness wide and soft, as though each movement unfolded on its own. The interior of the cottage was simple and still, the wooden walls holding a warmth that lingered even in the coolness of night, and the faint glow of the lantern outside filtered in through the doorway, casting a soft, shifting pattern across the floor, not bright enough to illuminate everything, but enough to soften the edges of what was there. Edward sat down on the chair near the window, though the window itself reflected only darkness, blending seamlessly with the open doorway, so that inside and outside no longer felt like separate places, but like different expressions of the same quiet space. As he rested there, he noticed how the gentle flow of air moved in and out of the cottage. Not in a way that could be measured, but in a way that could be felt, like a slow, steady breathing that did not belong to him alone, and as his own breath began to follow that same rhythm, the distinction between the two softened, until it felt as though the space itself was breathing, and he was simply part of that motion. There were no thoughts that needed to be followed, no memories that asked to be revisited, only a quiet awareness that everything was already open, already connected, without effort, without intention. The door remained as it was, neither closed nor open, and in that gentle balance, it seemed to hold a quiet truth, one that did not need to be spoken, that nothing had ever truly been separate, that the boundaries we notice are often softer than they appear, and that rest does not come from closing ourselves off, but from allowing everything to be just as it is. The lantern's glow continued to flicker faintly through the doorway, its light steady and calm, and as Edward allowed his body to settle more deeply into the chair, his eyes gradually closing, the sense of inside and outside, of here and there, of before and after, all began to dissolve into a single, quiet presence, where nothing needed to move, nothing needed to change, and where the door, always open in its own quiet way, simply remained, gently welcoming everything into rest. As the night deepened further into its quiet, seamless stillness, Edward became aware of something that felt like a path, though there was no visible trail upon the ground, no markings in the wood or stone, and no direction that could be pointed to with certainty, yet the sense of it was unmistakable, not as something seen, but as something gently known, like the memory of a place never visited. He remained seated for a time, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and steady, and within that calm, the feeling of the path seemed to unfold, not outward into distance, but inward into a soft, spacious awareness, where each moment appeared to open into the next without effort, without movement. Like a series of quiet doorways that required no step to pass through, when he eventually rose from the chair, his movements were unhurried, guided not by intention but by a natural flow, and as he walked toward the open doorway, the gentle night air met him again, carrying that same soft familiarity, as though nothing had changed and yet everything had deepened. Outside, the lantern still glowed with its steady warmth, its light resting lightly upon the harbor, and the sea remained calm, its surface smooth and undisturbed, reflecting only the faint shimmer of stars that seemed to linger just above it. Edward stepped onto the wooden planks and paused, not to decide where to go, but to allow the quiet sense of the path to continue revealing itself, and as he stood there, he realized that there was no destination ahead, no place waiting to be reached, only the gentle unfolding of presence itself, moment by moment, each one complete in its own stillness. He began to walk, though the movement felt almost secondary, as if the path did not depend on his steps, but simply accompanied them, appearing wherever he happened to be, and with each slow step, the world remained unchanged, no new sights, no new sounds, yet the depth of the quiet seemed to expand, like a vast space that grows not by extending outward, but by becoming more open within. The wooden planks beneath his feet gave way to smooth stones, and then to the soft edge of the shore, but the path did not alter, for it had never been tied to the ground, and as he continued, the distinction between walking and resting began to fade, until each step felt as still as standing, and each pause felt as continuous as movement. The lantern's glow followed him only in the sense that it remained present, its light never stretching farther or receding, simply existing as a steady point within the quiet, and the stars above remained unchanged. Neither shifting nor dimming, their calm presence echoing the stillness below. Time, once again, seemed to loosen its quiet hold, no longer marking progress, no longer dividing moments, and in that gentle release, Edward felt no need to measure where he had been or where he might go, for the path asked for nothing, required nothing, and led nowhere beyond itself. Eventually, without noticing when or how, he found himself once more near the cottage, the open doorway still as it had been, the interior resting in soft shadow, and as he paused there, the sense of the path did not end, but simply settled, like a quiet understanding that had always been present, that there is a way of moving through the world without leaving any trace, a way of being where nothing needs to be reached, and where every moment, untouched and complete, gently carries itself into rest. As the night unfolded into its deepest stillness, there came a quiet moment when even the faint distinctions between sound and silence, movement and rest, seemed to dissolve entirely, leaving behind a calm so complete that it did not feel like an absence, but like a presence, soft, steady, and unchanging. Edward stood once more near the cottage, the open doorway behind him and the lantern glowing gently at his side. And though everything appeared just as it had on countless nights before, there was a subtle shift in how it was felt, as if the world had settled into its simplest form, free of anything unnecessary, free of anything that asked to be noticed. The lantern's light, warm and unwavering, no longer seemed to illuminate the harbor as much as it quietly existed within it, neither pushing back the darkness nor being diminished by it, but resting in perfect balance. And as Edward gazed at it, not directly but with a softened awareness, he felt that same quality within himself, a quiet steadiness that did not depend on thought or effort, something that remained whether he paid attention to it or not. The sea stretched out before him, calm and infinite, its surface barely distinguishable from the sky, and the stars above, though still present, no longer felt separate or distant, but part of the same continuous stillness that held everything together without tension or division. He walked slowly to the bench and sat, his body settling naturally, without adjustment, as though it already knew how to rest, and as he allowed his hands to rest loosely, his shoulders to soften, his breath to flow without guidance, he became aware that nothing needed to be followed, nothing needed to be held, not even the quiet itself. The lantern flickered once, gently, then returned to its steady glow, and in that small, almost unnoticed movement, there was a sense of continuity, of something that remained even as it shifted, like a calm that does not depend on stillness, but includes even the slightest change without being disturbed. Time, if it moved at all, had become so subtle that it no longer marked anything, no longer carried moments forward or left them behind, but simply allowed them to exist, side by side, quiet and complete. Edward felt no need to close his eyes, and yet they grew heavier, not from tiredness, but from a natural softening, like the gradual dimming of light at the end of a long, peaceful day. And as his awareness settled further into that steady presence, the distinction between himself and the harbor, between the lantern and the darkness, between the breath and the air, all seemed to fade into a single, gentle continuity. Nothing was added, nothing was taken away, and in that simplicity, there was a quiet fullness, a sense that everything was already as it needed to be. The light of the lantern remained, not as something to be watched, but as something that simply stayed, steady and calm, asking for nothing, offering nothing, and in its quiet presence, Edward felt himself drifting, not away, but inward, into that same steady calm, where even the idea of drifting no longer mattered, and where the night, vast and silent, held everything in a soft, unbroken rest. At last, there came a night so quiet that it felt as though the harbor itself had begun to sleep, not in the way living beings sleep, with beginnings and endings, but in a deeper, more timeless way, where everything simply settles into its natural state of rest, without effort, without transition. Edward remained seated on the bench, the lantern beside him glowing with the same steady warmth it had always held. Yet now even its light seemed softer, as though it, too, had relaxed into the stillness, no longer reaching outward, but gently resting where it was. The sea lay completely calm, its surface like a dark mirror that reflected nothing and everything at once, and the sky above, though filled with stars, felt less like a distant expanse and more like a quiet presence that surrounded and included all things, near and far, dissolving into the same gentle vastness. Edward's breathing had become so slow and subtle that it no longer felt like a movement, but like a quiet continuation, as if each breath did not begin or end, but simply existed within the same calm rhythm that held the sea, the sky, and the soft glow of the lantern. There were no thoughts that needed to fade, no sensations that needed to change, only a deep, steady ease that had gradually unfolded through the night, layer by layer, until nothing remained but this quiet completeness. The open doorway of the cottage stood behind him, unchanged, neither inviting nor closing, simply present, and the path he had walked earlier no longer felt like something that had been traveled, but like something that had always been here, invisible and effortless, existing not in space, but in the gentle flow of awareness itself. The distant horizon had disappeared entirely now, not hidden, but no longer necessary, for there was no longer any sense of distance to define it, and in its place was only a soft, continuous presence that extended without edge or boundary. The lantern flickered once more, barely, then steadied again, its light unchanged in its quiet purpose, or perhaps in its lack of purpose, simply being as it was. Just as everything else was. Edward's eyes had closed without notice, not as a decision, but as a natural settling, like the final easing of a wave as it returns to the sea, and in that gentle closing, there was no sense of loss, no separation from what had been seen, only a deepening into what had always been felt, the harbor, the sea, the sky, the lantern, and Edward himself all seemed to rest together in that same quiet stillness, not as separate parts, but as a single, unbroken calm. And as the night held this stillness without effort, without change, it became clear, in a way that did not require words, that nothing more needed to happen, nothing more needed to be told, for the story had not ended, but had simply settled, like everything else, into rest, soft, steady, and complete, as the harbor, at last, slept.